Is Abkhazia turning against Russian control? In November 2024, Abkhaz protesters stormed the parliament in protest at Russia's growing influence in the territory, which broke away from Georgia almost 30 years ago. Since then, the region's pro-Russian president has resigned and Abkhazia appears headed for early elections. All this has naturally led to speculation that Moscow's power is under strain. So, what exactly sparked the unrest? And is Abkhazia really pushing back against Moscow? Hello and welcome. If you're new to the channel, my name is James Ker-Lindsay, and here I take an informed look at international relations, conflict, security and statehood. Almost all breakaway territories rely on a protector or patron state to survive. Faced with international isolation, these de facto states, as they're often otherwise known, rely on an external power for political and diplomatic support, as well as economic aid and assistance. More importantly, they almost always depend on them for security against the threat of reintegration from the country they've broken away from. In this sense, patrons are usually a crucial factor in secessionist conflicts. However, the relationship between de facto states and their patrons can be highly complex. While the breakaway territory needs its patron, this reliance on an outside power may cause considerable resentment, especially if the patron exerts significant political or economic control. Conversely, the patron may place its broader strategic interests over the wishes and needs of the breakaway entity, thereby creating even more friction. In this sense, while relations between de facto states and their patrons can be mutually beneficial, they can also be inherently unstable, sometimes even erupting into confrontation. This has been highlighted by recent tensions in Abkhazia. Having broken away from Georgia in the 1990s, it's relied on Russia for over 3 decades for much of its political, security and economic needs. And yet, there are signs that this relationship is now growing under strain. Abkhazia lies in the South Caucasus. At around 8,700 square kilometres or 3,600 square miles, Georgia lies to its east and Russia borders it to the north. The Black Sea runs along its southern coast. Its population is believed to be around 250,000. While figures are highly disputed, ethnic Abkhazians represent around half the population. The other half comprises Georgians, Armenians and Russians, as well as some smaller minorities. Abkhazia has a long history. Although part of medieval Georgia, it often had a distinct identity as a kingdom, principality or vassal state. However, having come under Russian imperial control during the first half of the 19th century, its status as a principality was abolished in 1864 when it became a Russian military province. This would last until the early 20th century. Following the Russian Revolution, Abkhazia was incorporated into the Georgian state that emerged in 1917. However, following the Red Army's conquest of Georgia, Abkhazia became a separate Soviet Socialist Republic within the new USSR. But this ended a decade later, in 1931, when Stalin, an ethnic Georgian, terminated this near-equal status, and Abkhazia was instead incorporated into Georgia as the Abkhazian Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic. This led to severe repression as tens of thousands of Abkhaz were deported to other parts of the Soviet Union and replaced by Russians, Georgians and Armenians. But while the oppression eased in the 1950s following Stalin's death, Abkhazia remained an autonomous republic within Georgia. Over the next 3 decades, Abkhazia continued in this relationship. However, as the Soviet Union began to weaken in the 1980s, Abkhazia called to become a separate republic within the Soviet Union. But unlike South Ossetia, another Georgian autonomous region, it didn't try to break away following Georgia's independence in 1991. Instead, it initially accepted continued autonomy within the country. However, this changed in 1992 when the Georgian government voted to restore the pre-Soviet constitution of Georgia. Believing this would end their autonomy, Abkhaz deputies in the Georgian parliament unilaterally declared independence on the 23rd of July 1992, thereby sparking a civil war. Although Georgian troops quickly seized control of Sukhumi, the Abkhaz capital, the victory was short-lived. Abkhaz militias, strengthened by Russian paramilitaries and equipment, launched a counterattack, and a year later, in July 1993, Sukhumi fell to the Abkhaz forces. While a Russian brokered ceasefire then led to the creation of a United Nations peace observation mission, the agreement soon broke down. As fighting resumed, Abkhazian troops seized almost all the region, forcibly expelling most ethnic Georgians. On the 14th of May 1994, the two sides reached another ceasefire agreement. Although the UN maintained its monitoring mission, Russian troops operating under the Commonwealth of Independent States peacekeeping force now patrolled the buffer zone between Georgia and Abkhazia. Meanwhile, Russia also led UN-sponsored peace talks. Over the next decade, peace talks made little progress, especially as Abkhazia signalled that it wouldn't be prepared to give up its independence. However, things began to shift in early 2004 when Georgia elected a new president, Mikhail Saakashvili. Promising to retake both Abkhazia and South Ossetia, Georgia launched an unsuccessful attack on the latter in August 2004. But when this failed to end South Ossetia's accession, Saakashvili switched tactics, instead now offering Abkhazia substantial autonomy. But this was rejected by Sukhumi. Instead, following Kosovo's declaration of independence in February 2008, Abkhazia called for its independence to now be recognised by the international community. Over the next few months, the situation rapidly deteriorated as Abkhazia accused Georgia of preparing to retake control, and Georgia insisted that Russia was getting ready to invade. In the end, everything came to a head on the 1st of August 2008. Following renewed fighting in South Ossetia, skirmishes erupted around Abkhazia, leading to a full-scale Russian invasion. However, the Russo-Georgian War was short-lived. Within 2 weeks, Russia had decisively beaten the Georgian forces, and soon afterwards Moscow announced that it had recognised both Abkhazia and South Ossetia as independent states. Over the next few years, Russia actively campaigned for broader international acceptance of both Abkhazia and South Ossetia. However, unlike Kosovo, which received substantial support, especially from the West, the two territories remained largely isolated. Although they were recognised by several Russian allies such as Venezuela, Nicaragua and Syria, as well as a few small and impoverished Pacific islands that later changed their minds, most of the world steadfastly ignored their claims to statehood. While Moscow's recognition gave Abkhazia a greater sense of security, Russia steadily increased its presence in the territory, making it an increasingly significant internal actor as well. In addition to exerting considerable influence over political developments, Russia steadily strengthened its economic dominance over Abkhazia. While Russian aid and subsidies funded infrastructure projects and covered large parts of the Abkhaz state budget, including pensions and public sector salaries, Russian trade and investment and Russian tourists became the central mainstay of the Abkhaz economy. Meanwhile, Moscow also steadily increased its security and military presence in the territory. In addition to stationing troops and building bases, Russia took a more direct role in covering Abkhazia's security. For example, it took responsibility for manning the frontier with Georgia in 2009. Then, in 2014, as Russia annexed Crimea, the two signed a strategic partnership. In addition to establishing a joint military force, Abkhazia now agreed to harmonise its foreign and defence policies with Moscow, a deal that promised over $270 million of subsidies to Abkhazia over the next 3 years. I hope you're finding this useful. If so, please do consider giving the video a like and perhaps subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. It all really helps. Thanks so much. And now, back to the video. So, just what sparked the most recent incidents? In truth, tensions have been building for quite some time. Notwithstanding the promised aid, over the past decade, Russian subsidies have fallen substantially from $300 million in 2012 to $140 million in 2020. Additionally, Abkhazia was particularly badly affected by the COVID pandemic, which hit the tourism-dominated economy hard and highlighted weaknesses in the territory's health service, especially compared to neighbouring Georgia, which fared much better and offered Abkhazia support. Meanwhile, despite falling Russian state support, fears were growing over Russian involvement in the private sector as Russian companies and individuals increasingly bought up local businesses and purchased private properties, increasing prices and making ownership all but impossible for young Abkhaz. And it was against this backdrop that the turning point came in November 2024 when the Abkhazian authorities proposed a new law extending Russian ownership of local companies and land. Amidst claims that this would allow Russia to completely dominate Abkhazia, demonstrations erupted that saw protesters storm the Abkhaz parliament and other government buildings and attempt to take control of the public broadcaster. But while the government quickly withdrew the bill, the protests continued. Having reportedly fled to the safety of a Russian military base, on the 19th of November, the Abkhaz president, Aslan Bzania, stepped down, citing a need to maintain stability and constitutional order. So, just what does all this mean? Is opposition to Russia now reaching a tipping point? On the one hand, Russian domination is certainly feeding a degree of resentment. Over the past decade and a half, Moscow has become a critical factor in all aspects of the territory's economic and political life. But at the same time, we also have to be careful about reading too much into all this. This sort of unrest certainly isn't new. In fact, this is the third time a leader has been forced from power since 2008. More to the point, like any de facto state, Abkhazia can't simply turn against its patron. Although there may be anger and frustration about Russia's role, for as long as Abkhazia remains internationally isolated and unwilling to consider reunification with Georgia, the Abkhaz also know that they rely on Moscow for prosperity and protection. They can't simply reject Russia, at least for now. Indeed, it was widely noted that the protesters even carried Russian flags. And it's for all these reasons that many observers are urging caution about seeing this as a full-scale revolt against Moscow. More to the point, the Russian government was careful to keep its distance and didn't step in to help the territory's leader. Of course, none of this is to say that things can't or won't change. The Abkhaz may increasingly question whether a settlement with Georgia is preferable to Russian domination. But for now, there's little sign that this is the case generally. While some Abkhaz may see this as an option, most still see Russia as their preferred partner. That said, this may well change in the future. For example, and as seen in other cases, the pull of potential European Union membership can be very influential indeed, especially if it leads to more aid and opportunities for young people to look for work across Europe. But for now, this scenario doesn't seem likely, especially as Georgia appears to be moving steadily further away from the EU. More to the point, the recent events expose a far more problematic reality. Even if de facto states decide that they would find reunification with their former parent state preferable to continued control by their patron state, by that point they're usually so entirely dominated by the patron state, economically, politically and militarily, that they can't pursue another path. The patron state effectively controls the territory. By pursuing independence from one state, they become wholly dependent on another. For all these reasons, what we're seeing in Abkhazia underscores the degree to which de facto states, despite having declared independence, are invariably anything but independent. I hope you found that useful. If so, here are some more videos that you might find interesting. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next video.